2, 3, 4.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the Power of Music Thinking. My name is Christoph Zürn, and this is the podcast for people with a musical heart and a wicked job. We're looking for stories, insights and tools from the big world of music to inspire leaders and followers to listen, tune, play and perform in whatever field you're operating. The circle is round, not only because this is the last episode of the year, but also because we started this year with the science and music dialogue of a young researcher and her approach to translating research into a poem and live music. Now, we end this year with a young researcher who used improvisation and music as an experimental approach for her thesis on forest and nature conservation. With this approach, she won the Birgit Elands Thesis Prize just a few weeks ago. In her thesis, she included 5 piano pieces accompanying 5 different storylines, patterns, and themes that resulted from her research. So, let's listen to the research and the music. Welcome, Leonoor. Welcome to the Power of Music Thinking.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Leonoor, I always start the conversations with the same question. What was your first sonic experience or album or concert that had an impact on you?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think live music is very important for me. Usually when I was younger, I used to go to quite some classical music with my parents, also in church, but also directly to classical live music. But then for me personally, what affected me more is I think my first concert with friends going to a Hozier concert. So it's more, it's not classical music, but it was really impactful for me because it felt really emotional and it was really nice to share that with friends. I guess you know the song Take Me to Church. You've probably heard of it. And once you hear it, you'll recognize it probably.
Hozier, nice. So it's good always to learn something new. But what was so special of it?
I think it was 2 things. He's my favorite artist and he's really good live. It was all live music and he has a really powerful voice, which is really nice. But then on the other hand, it was really nice to share it with friends. And now every time we can, we go with the 3 of us to his concert. So it has a special memory as well. Yeah.
Nice. So, Leonoor, can you introduce yourself very briefly, and then we dive into where we're here for?
Yeah. My name is Leonoor. I'm a master's student currently. I'm 24 years old, and I'm doing 2 masters here in Wageningen at Wageningen University. And in general, I try to study the most I can about human-nature relationships, whether it's from a more ecological perspective or more social sciences. And I really like music. So that's sort of a combination of why I'm here, I think.
Absolutely. And you're here because my daughter pointed me to your thesis and you won a prize. You won the thesis award and there was something with music. And then I thought, hey, so we get the contact and maybe just start what thesis was it? Also, it has let's say, a title that we have to explain, I think. So I also had to think about, what does it really mean? So yes, please.
Yeah, so this was my master thesis for the Master Forest and Nature Conservation. And the thesis is called Insecure in the Anthropocene, in which I explored the role of rationality and emotions in ontological security. And ontological security, if I can translate it into more simple terms, is feeling secure in the way you know the world. So having trust that the world is how you think it is. And insecurity is then that your worldview or the way you know the world is sort of destabilized. And in my thesis, my point of departure was sort of that the ecological crisis, so climate and biodiversity crises, destabilize our world because it destabilizes our sense of humans and nature and the separation of it. And that leaves us insecure. And I explored how we respond to that insecurity, and specifically looking at what role do we give to emotionality or rationality, and how does it make some sort of storyline.
So the title is Insecure in the Anthropocene. Maybe we can explain what Anthropocene is. Maybe many people know, but maybe it's good to share or to explain a little bit more what it is.
Yeah, so it's not an uncontroversial term, but it tries to acknowledge the influence humans have now on the world around us. That we are such a force that influences our climate, our landscapes, and the biodiversity. So that's, in simple terms, what the Anthropocene stands for. But once again, it is quite controversial. There, also in my thesis, I mentioned it's not everyone agrees with it, but it's sort of to acknowledge the effect humans have on the world.
All right. And I think the Anthropocene just starts, let's say, 100 years ago or something like this.
Yeah, I think I should have checked this, but I think it's the Industrial Revolution, but I'm not quite sure actually.
But anyway, so if it's Industrial Revolution, then it would be a little bit longer. But it's like that the impact that we humans do in a way that was, let's say, all the many years that we live here on the planet, it was more or less in a balance. But now with the Industrial Revolution, or with everything that we are doing, maybe the last 50 to 100 years, the exponential use of material and sources, and so that's actually what the Anthropocene is.
Yeah,
right?
it's sort of that the human influence sort of competes now with geophysical influence, or what was previously just like the climate on whatever physical or natural forces, and now we have such a large influence that we compete with that, and that's why we call it the Anthropocene. Yeah. Yeah,
but it helps a little bit what we're talking about. So it's a scientific paper, and it's about, you just mentioned it very quickly, the ontological insecurity, meaning, and ontological meaning, let's say that's the philosophy of being, to let's say in simple words, and being means in the way that every person has some kind of history, what you do when you were a kid, and everything adds up to be insecure because you understand the world, you know how it works, because you had certain experiences, either personal experiences or maybe also TV or in another medium. And now the point is like, hang on, but there is now something emerging like that. A lot of people have some kind of insecurity in the way that how they came into the world and where will it go to.
Yeah, sort of. It's not only internal. So I would say it's not only about you as an individual, but really about how you maybe situate yourself in the world around you, but also how you understand the world around you. And in this way, in my thesis, I really took this lens of, okay, our natural environment also affects this security and is sort of a source and a baseline for this sense of security. And then also, if you see that changing due to landscape changes or environmental changes, biodiversity loss, that can also affect this source of security, and therefore you become more insecure. So I wouldn't say it's only about your way of being, but it's really also about the world. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So because your being is in context with the world around you, and you try to make sense out of it.
Yeah, but also you and the world are sort of in constant conversation with each other, I would say. And that also forms you, but also the world around you. So it's a two-way street.
Right. So you have an influence also in the way how I, as a person, or everybody as a different person, perceives it and then talks about it. And then you might see patterns.
Yeah, and also I think the way you understand the world and how you express that also in turn shapes the world itself. So it's the performativity also of it. And and it's not, you're not an isolated thing that can think about things outside of it. It's not so rigid in inside and outside or internal, external. But that's more also theoretical, but also personal. Maybe other people find this really weird, which I don't know.
But there's nothing wrong with weird as long as you know, and you won a prize. So weird.
Okay.
It look really weird.
Yes, that's true.
How did you approach it? And maybe we can reveal that there's a musical aspect in it.
Yeah. So the sort of the methodology I used was that I did a discourse analysis. And this means that I looked into different ways in which people give meaning to the world, and then in this specific context of ontological security and the ecological crisis. And I did so by also looking at newspaper articles, but mostly doing focus groups. So interview-like settings with multiple people, or one-on-one interviews as well. And here I sort of analyzed how they talked about the environment, their relationship to nature, or the climate crisis, and then looked into that with discourse theory, and then came up with different storylines people had in response to the ecological crisis or in response to insecurity. So with a storyline, it's sort of, you need something to hold on to make sense of the world, and you can shape that in the shape of a storyline. And I sort of found 5 different ones people mentioned or arose of what people said. And then with those storylines, I looked into, okay, what role does rationality give, and what role do emotions get?
Oh, interesting for a scientist to also get into the emotions.
Yeah, and that was sort of, I think it was my initial motivation actually to do this thesis, because personally, I find my relationship to nature very emotional, but then my education is very rational. And sometimes those two can't really hold space for each other, but they're, I would say they're on a scale. So it's not either one or the other. It's always sort of a little bit of both. And I thought, okay, it's really interesting that we give so much value to rationality in science, but also in the way we argue for or against climate action, whilst emotions are so important in this. So that's why I thought, okay, I want to look more into how does this come about, and how do we give this role to them. So that's why I also wanted to really focus on this. And then again, because science can be so focused on rationality and does not always hold space for emotionality, I thought, okay, what other language can I use to make space for these emotions? And that was music in my case, just because I think, it engages me when I think about it more emotionally, because you have to feel it to make music. And also the people who read it can now listen to the music, so it's not just text, and it's not just a cognitive consumption of the storyline, but also, okay, I need to engage emotionally because I'm listening to the music as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. So because thinking about science is most of the time rational and often not emotional in that sense, or emotions, if I get it right, is something like that we interpret that some people have certain kinds of emotions, that some people maybe also misinterpret emotions from someone else. So, and the rationality would be something to make clear that it's only one way, the way that you have proven it.
Yeah, it can be. I do think there are already, or especially in the social sciences, it's already quite common to have this more interpretivist way of doing research. So there is not just one answer, which you'd see more in the exact sciences where this is the assumption. So I do think there is already some space for emotions. But yeah, I think specifically in this topic, also, if you look around you in the way we talk about climate change, it's always about numbers or decrease in biodiversity, it's in percentages, but it's not much about how we feel about that and how our feelings in turn also affect the way we act or the way we see the world. And that doesn't mean that those numbers aren't important, because they definitely are. But I think sometimes we can balance it a little bit more.
Absolutely, and to connect them at least, and to bring them together. Because when we have demonstrations on the street, you could say, "Wow, there's only emotions on the street and less rationality." So it means it affects us as humans, and we don't respond very rational to it, so then maybe more emotional.
Yeah, and I think also my biggest issue personally was that sometimes rationality was seen as of such higher value than emotionality, that sort of rubbed me the wrong way. I thought, why is that? And it sort of also delegitimizes some people's experience, which I don't think is fair. So it's also sort of a personal motivation in okay, how can I acknowledge the different balances more, and how do they interplay as well? If people have very different understanding or value rationality or emotionality more, how do they interact? I think that's just a really interesting thing, and it's also very human to have a little bit of both. But then some people have more of this, some people have more of that, and that doesn't always match very well, but sometimes it does. Yeah.
And in your research that you just said, interviews, focus groups, there came, let's say, can you tell them, or can you tell, are these results that you came with the storyline? Is the storyline a result, or is this a pattern, or can you elaborate on this?
So the storyline, I constructed the storylines based out of what people express or what I found in articles. It's a result. It's my interpretation of the data I collected. And then I structured it in a specific sense. And it's also, I would say the research is quite transparent. So people can read it and think, okay, I would have probably come up with a different result. That's also possible. But then at least you can see how I got to the result. And then from those storylines, I look at, okay, what patterns do we see? And how does that, for example, relate to change or not wanting to change? So it's really an interpretation of data. And from that, I made some results.
Right. The story. And what are the 5 storylines? Will you share this with us?
The first storyline is that there is hope, that technology is our savior, so it can save us, but alarmism is our enemy, or we shouldn't have alarmism. And then the second one...
What does alarmism mean? So that when we sense, so someone says, hey, you have to change, this is getting wrong.
It's this really strong expression of that something is really going wrong, which we also see actually in another storyline, the 5th one, which is every decimal counts. That's the one sort of at the opposite of this storyline, because it's a very emotional one. And then in the middle, as the second storyline, you have climate change and the biodiversity crisis are inherently human issues. I think I formulated it like that. That's also quite still a rational storyline, which really focuses on nuance and on knowledge of the importance of that in response to the ecological crisis. And then the third one, let me see.
Nature will survive?
Yeah, nature will survive and humanity might not.
Interesting.
It's a very interesting one. This one has a bit more acceptance of this insecurity, and also gains, I think, hope and acceptance from the fact that, or the idea that nature will survive either way, and that we have to be responsible for our own fate in that sense. And then the 4th one is that we have to reconnect to nature. So it sees really this solution in reconnecting to nature, to having a better relationship to nature, so that we can in turn mitigate the climate and biodiversity crisis.
So when you first found the patterns, and then you changed or you translated the patterns into the storylines, and then the music comes in. Or was there also music in the research? Did, for example, people, I don't know, talk about music or maybe talk about listening? For example, I can imagine that when people talk about nature, that they, let's say, talk about the birds or some, let's say, animal or the wind through the trees. Was there any emotion there already in your research?
Yeah, in that sense, definitely people really talked about hearing the birds or feeling emotional to that kind of natural experience. But I wouldn't say music was in that way part of the research already. It was more a little bit more isolated in the way that I gathered data, I did interviews, and then emotions arose or certain thoughts arose, and then I started maybe improvising already a little bit. So it was my interpretation of what people mentioned themselves.
How can we picture this? So you're in the middle of you've done all the interviews and the research. You sit there, and after your thesis, you write stuff, and then there's a moment where you think, wait a minute, I go to the piano, or how did this work?
So it was already the plan from the start to incorporate music in it. So it was in my research proposal, I already said, let's try this out. So it's really an experiment. I also really wouldn't say it's bulletproof, but it was an experiment to include a more emotional language aside from this textual discourse analysis.
Mainly in the communication of it, in the communication of the results.
In a way, but also to create a deeper understanding for myself, because it really forced me to engage more emotionally with what I was finding instead of remaining in this very research cognitive mode of thinking. I also thought, okay, it is about emotion. So how can I sort of be more open to those emotions? And that I needed something else for that than just writing stuff down. So since I knew from the beginning that the idea was to make some kind of musical interpretation of the results, I also always had this sort of ear open whilst I was doing the research to feel like, oh, this sort of inspires me to make this kind of music, or oh, this feels like this. How can I put this into a melody?
So would you, after, let's say, you had a focus group session or an interview, would you then go to the piano or think about a certain emotion or atmosphere?
Yes, I would sometimes, and then just record it, and it was just improvisation. And then I didn't know the storylines yet because I was still in the middle of collecting data. But then I just added something like rational, sad music, or sort of as a note. So I would just have this emotion, and I would know where it would come from, but I could just sort of put it out somewhere and then not think about it anymore.
But did you already express it in music, or did you write it down like what you just said? It's more sad music, or did you try to, let's say in design we would say prototype it, and in music we might say you demoing it. You have an idea, you just instead of writing down, oh, this is very depressing, you would play something. Is it that way?
Yeah, it was the last. So it was more demoing. So, and for me, it's just improvising. So maybe starting out with a chord or maybe a certain key and thinking, oh, it feels a little bit like this, or a melody sometimes as well, or a structure of music. Especially in the second storyline, you hear this sort of pensive structure, which sort of came from the beginning. So that was more the process at the beginning.
Yeah, we could listen to some, because you just mentioned the second one. Shall we have a listen and then talk about it?
Yeah, that's okay.
So the second one, human issue, right?
Yeah.
This was the pulse that you just mentioned, right?
Yeah. Sort of a constant, this pedal note. Yeah.
And then melody comes in.
Mm-hmm.
Does the melody here has a meaning?
But in combination with the pedal note, I would say. So it's about this really pensive storyline, which you hear by the repeated line under it. And the melody has something hopeful, but it's also quite sad. And it just keeps on going. It has this, I would say it's quite nuanced. It's not really intense music. But it has quite a lively melody. It's about the species liveliness.
And what's the storyline with this? Maybe just
so this is about climate change and the biodiversity crisis being inherently human issues, which does not ignore the detrimental effects it has on biodiversity, but instead says, but we as humans give meaning to this crisis. We value it as a crisis, so therefore it's inherently a human issue, to summarize it quickly. And it has this really nuanced, and it's so focused on knowledge and putting things in perspective. So it's quite a cognitive storyline, and it has some emotional distance to it. So that's maybe what you hear. It's quite thoughtful, I would say. Or that's at least what I was trying to convey.
Yeah, right. Oh, it's at least thoughtful for you. Did you test later how people respond just to the music?
No, I didn't. And it would have been really nice to do it. But then for me, it was difficult because the start and the finish of my research was 6 months.
Yeah.
So for me, it wasn't really possible within the scope of my research. But it would have been really nice because I would have been really curious if I would have played this music for people who I would place in the storyline, how they would have responded to it.
Right, and it also has a lot to do with the people that are in a certain emotion at the moment. So, do you know the conductor Benjamin Sander? He wrote a book about possibility, and he also did a lot of talks. And he's one of his famous stories is he talks about a piece from Chopin. And he plays this for young people that never heard classical music. And Chopin has also piano is a certain kind of music. And then he asked for reactions from the students, and then you get like, it's boring, and it depends on what kind of background you have. And he does something interesting that he said, I want to play it for you again. And please keep someone in mind that is not there anymore. And then plays it again, and then the emotions come, and from people that maybe thought, it's just someone playing piano. Then you give meaning. So maybe interesting for a test how this would, how people respond to it. And that's also interesting because everyone has a different perspective. So as you just said, and maybe a different storyline. Hey, we can give it a try. I have some more, but then we don't tell what it is. And then, but later, which one would you like to hear? Or shall we?
Now you can choose one. I don't mind.
I think I choose this one, and then you can explain, and people and everyone who listens now can come in with their meaning, what they think, what this does, and it's in relation to to how we experience the change in nature, or how can we?
Yeah, you could say it like that. Yeah.
Okay, so here it comes. Stuff here, so everybody can now form their meaning, their emotions, or try to understand what it is.
Should I explain a little bit what I tried to convey? Yeah. So even for me, when I hear it again, I've played it a couple of times in presentations, and it makes me feel really rushed, which I guess was also the point. It's sort of, it makes me a little bit uncomfortable in the sense that I feel like something is chasing me. And that's also maybe a little bit the point, because this is the music for the storyline Every Decimal Counts. And this storyline has a great sense of urgency around the ecological crisis. It really says it could be catastrophic, but we should do something about it right now. It's quite an emotional storyline. And this urgency I try to convey with this this stronger tempo and sort of staccato, and you feel like something is chasing you. That's at least what I was trying. So I'm really curious about what the listener was feeling when they listened to a piece of music. And then somewhere later on in this piece, there comes a little bit more calmness, because it also has quite a black and white character. Either if we go above 1.5 degrees of warming, it will be really bad, but below it we can still be okay. So it's also this black and white. I thought, okay, it really has to have some contrast in this piece. So, which you also see in the one for storyline 4. So I try to play with different techniques there to see how can I convey this feeling.
So what's the technique for storyline 4?
It was really about contrast, and it also this storyline has something romantic about it, because it says it could be really nice once we have reconnected to nature. It could turn out really good, and it has sort of this romanticized idea about it. But then it starts with this, uncomfortability, I would say, because right now we're not at that place. I would say I made this contrast in the song by starting quite heavy, and then at some point, I don't think you would immediately expect it, but then it becomes really light, because you get this beautiful scenario of what it could be once we reconnect to nature. So this is the lightness for the song.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Reconnecting. In the beginning, I thought if this would be, let's say, in a documentary, for example, and you see certain pictures, I even thought some kind of bird song would accompany it. So it starts, and then you might hear, let's say, some birds tweeting.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's really funny because what I said before, I started with these immediate improvisations during the data collection. And then once I wrote down the results, so I structured all these different storylines, then I had to try and find a really different mode of working with music, because usually for me, this is not what I do. I just improvise and that's it. I'm not a structured music writer, and I can't read music, so it has to be all from the top of my head. And now I had to sort of make a structure for a certain storyline, which wasn't necessarily my own. So it really had to, I had to be really creative about it. And then I started making sort of adding colors to the different storylines to sort of engage me more creatively, or making sort of figures, whether they're like square or is it round, or so in that way, sort of trying to find a way around working really outside of my comfort zone. But to come back to what you said about the birds, I can really imagine it, because when I was thinking about it, I was thinking of these fluent motions at some point, or this high contrast, but once you come to this lighter side, it had to be romantic and sort of with a lightness about it. So I guess flying or seeing bird movements, that really ties into it. Yeah.
Just thinking about what you said, in the way that you improvised after you did interviews or after you found some patterns. Did you also, and you said that you recorded this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Do you still have all these recordings?
I don't think so. I think I have a few still. But as you can also hear it's just my phone recording, and then and I notice whenever I play or I press record, my playing turns really bad. So I also don't really like to record myself. But I think I have a few. Yeah. Do you want to hear one or not?
No, I'm asking, yeah, we could, but I'm asking for it to document your research, where you have different steps and, let's say, iterations in finding or coding different patterns that you have, and bring them together. And then at a certain moment, you make a storyline out of it, and then you translate it. Actually, you could even dive into your own process of working as a researcher, but with two different skills, the cognitive skill and the emotional skill that is coming out of the music. If you would keep them all and also document them all, you could later analyze your music if this would go parallel, or if your emotion would have branched out at a certain point where your rationality didn't. That's just what comes up for me.
Yeah, definitely. It would have been really cool. I don't think I would be skilled for that, to analyze my own music. But it would be really interesting to see.
It could be material for someone else, like a musicologist, for example.
Yeah.
You'd say, "Oh, interesting. Oh, now getting there and this," because interesting, you're improvising. So, and by the way, I still would like to make, in some way, the link to, we all know, or many people know, that Albert Einstein was a formidable piano player and also a violin player. And it said that when he was in his working room and really thinking about abstract things, that sometimes he just came out, played for 1 hour piano, and then went back. So as the piano playing would, in a non-cognitive way, solve some of the problems that he couldn't do, and that's why he came out to take a break or to get into a different way. So that reminds me in some way that there are different ways for, I would say, for researchers to literally play with it and come to a point where it's also shareable, because we don't have recordings from Albert Einstein, but I can imagine that if you use music, and you don't necessarily have to play the piano by yourself, you could also take anything. What you could also make a mood board of musics that you, when you're working as a researcher, say, oh, now I want to make a playlist of these 3 songs that represent what I just did here, and later you just make a chronological playlist and try to sync it with the decisions that you've made in your research.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Would you say that is also the way you work? Do you work with that if you have to engage with something cognitively, that you move to music to sort of try something new, or?
You mean me?
Yeah.
Work. Yeah, sometimes well. So sometimes it's like when you work on something, then you don't want any music because it distracts you. And in my case, it's not like that. I have music in mind when I see something. But if I play, maybe that's, and I don't want to compare myself to someone else like Einstein, but sometimes it's good to stop. And maybe for other people, it's do a walk or cook something or play sports and then get back to work. For me, it's sometimes helped just to play one of the instruments and then get back without thinking too much about it. And I think maybe that's also a little bit that our body tries to connect the body and the mind in some way without knowing everything what the mind or what the body really does. So we don't have to translate everything, but I think it goes together. And in that sense, it doesn't necessarily has to be a direct translation of it, but it's just a different, let's call it resonance that goes in a different way. But anyway, that's something that I experience more often, just to say, okay, now I want to play something, and then I will work or do something else together.
Yeah, definitely. And I think also what you said about connecting the mind and the body, it's also about connecting what is maybe unconscious for you. And through playing music, it becomes more conscious. And you think, oh, interesting that this comes out. How could that be? Or where does this come from? I think that's also sort of beauty of improvisation or making music whilst you're really thinking hard, because it can bring up something that's really buried beneath all these thoughts. And maybe it releases something you wouldn't expect, but it's still interesting.
Absolutely. And it's always interpretation, and interpretation has to do with your own ontology. So who you are and how you make sound of it. There are examples of more in the agency world or in the organizational change world, where you ask a team, for example, to sketch the organization, but not, let's say, not in a hierarchy, but just to make a nice drawing of how the organization works without any words. And if you do this, then you can ask musicians to use this as a graphical score and play it. And then you don't, and the musicians have to make a decision if a line is a long tone or if a line is constant playing or what else it is. So there's an interpretation always involved. But the interesting part is that you then ask the people that made the score what they heard. And sometimes they hear something that and that's why I say it, because you just mentioned the undercurrent and the unconscious things, that they unconsciously drew something into the graphical score that they might not have give it a name if they should write something to it, but it's there. And that's something that really plays together. And that's something that could be researched a bit, some kind of action research to see what comes out of it, and then see if this makes any sense.
Yeah, definitely.
So it's a nice broad field. So I would say thank you very much for sharing all your insights, and also interesting that I first thought it was a little bit more composing, in the sense that you have a storyline, and then the storyline gets let's say illustrated in some way. But I think it's nice that you improvised it, and that it's much more closer to the researcher that has a brain but also a body with hands and can play a piano, and that this actually goes together. I think that's an interesting insight.
Yeah, I think for me as a researcher, but also as a piano player, it was also really different experience, because I had to connect this improvisation or this more emotional way of working to this more cognitive way of doing research. So it really, in the end, became this interplay between the two. And I think that's sort of the point, which is really nice.
Do you think this would also work if you would do this in a team, let's say in a trio, and that 3 researchers work together and then they close the day with making music and not talking about it, and then in retrospect listen what happens?
Oh, that would have been really cool. I think then it becomes really interesting how you respond to other people's interpretation of it. And I think that in itself, the response can already be a different result. Maybe not the one you were looking for in the research, but it can say really something about your understanding of it, and which can in turn also inform the research. So it would have been really different, I think, but really interesting.
So that was maybe also my next step question. What's next? Is this something that you will do more often? Is this something that you maybe even help people to understand what it is, and maybe also encourage people to do the same? So is there also a result on, let's say, on the way how you approached it?
Well, to be fair, it was really an experiment for me. It was my master thesis, so it's not published research in that way. So I had space to experiment, which I really enjoyed, but it was also quite difficult. And I would not call myself an expert in any way on either piano or this type of research. So that makes me a little bit more humble in the way that I don't know what the next steps are. I do think involving creative processes into research can be really beneficial. So that is really definitely something I want to continue exploring. But I'm definitely not ready to teach it yet or be in any way an expert on it.
So art-based approaches, they're different also in different kind of arts, but also music. Shall we end with the first one?
Oh, yeah.
Can you explain the storyline and then we play?
Yeah, it's really interesting because this is the type of music I would never play myself. So it was really difficult for me to sort of make music for this storyline. It's about the one about technology being our savior and our alarmism our enemy. And within that, in my interpretation, I wanted to have a bit of a cynical element in it, but it's also hopeful, optimistic, and it wants to continue the status quo in some type of way, which I translated into music I wouldn't really listen to myself, but yeah.
Let's give it a try, and thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate this, because listening is one of the top leadership skills, and I feel honored about this. It is my mission to find, create, and share inspirations for meaningful collaboration based on music analogies. If you want to support this, please subscribe to the podcast, give us a rating, or write a review on iTunes or Spotify. And more inspirations can be found on musicthinking.com. We have a blog, and you can download the Music Thinking Framework. And finally, I would love to hear your feedback. And if you need help with a business challenge, please reach out to me via email, podcast@musicthinking.com.